Hi, everyone. Good evening. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for joining us. My name is Asha, and I'm part of the Word Lab at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, and we host city scripts and authors in conversation every month. So thank you for being here. Just before we start, just a few housekeeping things. We'll be taking questions at the end of the session, so please use the Q&A box on your screens to share your questions with our speakers. We'll also be recording the session and hosting it on our YouTube channel, and I'll be sharing the link there. And if you'd like to sort of stay connected with everything that we do at IIHS, you can drop us your email and we will add you to our mailing list. So I'd like to introduce our panelists very quickly before we start the conversation. So we have Christopher Kloeble. I think I got it right the first time I said it.
Perfect.
Is an award-winning scriptwriter and the author of 3 novels, a short story collection, and a memoir. He's taught at Dartmouth College, Georgetown University, Cambridge University, and Hong Kong University, among others. His books have been translated into 9 languages. He lives in Berlin and New Delhi, and today we'll be talking about his book, The Museum of the World. Rekha Kamath Rajan, who's translated the book, spent the better part of her life reading, studying, and teaching German literature at Elphinstone College in Mumbai and at the Center for German Studies at JNU University in Delhi. Her research focuses on representations of India in the German literary and missionary discourse. Thank you both for being here. Our moderator for this evening is Somak Ghoshal, and we're very happy to have him back with us. It's been a while. He's a writer, editor, and book critic interested in the arts, culture, and human rights. So please, Somak, all yours.
Thank you, Asha.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And it's a real pleasure this evening to talk to you, Christopher and Rekha. I have loved the book and read it in one breath almost. I have to say, one doesn't get to read such good translations in India sitting here. So I was absolutely thrilled to read such a lovely translation of a really, really fascinating story. So it's a real privilege and honor for me to talk to you today.
Good to you. I agree about the translation. Wait, there you are.
Thank you. And I have a lot of questions about the translations, but I'll come to that later. I think those of us who have joined in and may not be familiar with the book, I just want to say a couple of words about the book first. To me, it was a very refreshing surprise to read a book which read like a traditional boy's story, like the adventure story that you would read of a certain kind, Robert Louis Stevenson and all of that. And it has this really, really powerful pace. You read a page turner. I mean, that's a very cliched term, I know. But in this case, the plot absolutely gallops ahead. This is a story of a 12-year-old boy called Bartholomew in the 1850s India. And he's been brought up by German missionaries. And then suddenly he sort of sets off on this adventure completely by accident in order to unravel a mystery that is kind of plaguing him. And his great mission in life is to build this museum of the world, which has multiple layers of significance and such a beautiful idea at the heart of the book, I think. So I don't want to give away too much of the plot because it's really a book for readers. You would just find yourself so absorbed in the story. It's the sheer power of storytelling that drives you on with this book. But I want to actually start today's session by asking Christopher about, the thought behind this book. I know it's based on real historical figures, but the fact that it's been turned into fiction and distilled into fiction so beautifully. If you could talk about some of your inspirations and how you got started on this book.
Sure. Thank you so much. This is a really good introduction of the book already. I think in the beginning, I just came across this, story about these 3 Bavarian brothers who, in this time in the 1850s traveled also all over Asia and High Asia, South Asia and High Asia, and who, made a lot of discoveries, but only 2 of them returned to Germany. And then when I just heard about them, I felt like, okay, that's interesting. It's like a very, 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 very big expedition of that time. And so I read a bit more about them, and I found like, okay, it's actually a really good story, but I'm not sure how I should write about it, because we're now living in 21st century, so 100 years ago I probably would have just written it from the perspective of these brothers and telling a tale of like, oh, exotism, and be like, oh, that's so, I don't know, it's so strange and foreign, this place, India, and then like the things they discover, and then I would have told that. But like, you know, time has passed and we know so much more about the world nowadays, and many books have been written in the way I've just described them, like even in the 19th century already. So I felt like I had to have a different approach, and it took me a while until I figured out Bartholomew being the protagonist, because when I kind of realized that what would be really interesting to tell that whole story about expeditions and conquerors and whatever, and adventure, but from the opposite view, you know, from someone who lives in a country where those people come to the country and tell you, like, you know, your name is not actually your name, you have a different name, and this mountain has a different name, and so on. Then I felt suddenly more excited, but I also felt like this is closer to the way we talk about these topics nowadays. Like, what does, you know, colonizing mean? What did it mean to the people there? And especially in terms of, I didn't write the book obviously in English, and my first audience wasn't an English speaking audience, it was a German audience. And in Germany, in my context, it's still the case that it's not so widely discussed yet, like the colonial times, which has its own reasons we can go into, but it never has been a really big topic. And so I felt like I would like to talk more about and write a story about this. But of course I had to find a frame, like you said, I wanted to tell an adventure story, kind of like a Indiana Jones for India, kind of.
Yeah, I'm completely in agreement. I mean, it is very much a fun story at the heart of it, but there are very dark layers to it. And I'll come back to Bartholomew because I think the way you have positioned him as a character is the most fascinating part of the book for me. But just to come to Rekha, I know that you work on the history of missionaries, German missionaries in India, and that's one of your research areas. And this is a topic which not many of us in India know. I mean, we know about the British colonizers and the missionaries coming in. But if you could throw some light on this period and what these German missionaries were doing, which cities were they coming to, what kind of activities they were carrying out. Rekha, you're on mute.
I have basically worked on German missionaries. In fact, the first Protestant mission in the world, and these were German missionaries who came to Tranquebar, that is Tarangambadi, which is in Tamil Nadu. Unfortunately, my period of work on the missionaries encompasses the 18th century. They arrived here in India in 1706, and the mission actually lasted till about 1830, but I stopped at around the turn of the century. So I have worked on the 18th century and German missionaries. I mean, at a period of time before English missionaries were allowed into the country. So in fact, some of these German missionaries then from Tarangambadi, they went to Madras, to Kadalur and other places and set up mission stations there, which were also funded by the English SPCK, the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. So the English missionaries had a kind of a backdoor, not missionaries, but they had Anglican Church had a backdoor entry into India through the German missionaries. And once, of course, the English missionaries came in, that has not been really my area of work. So I've concentrated on the 18th century.
Right. It's fascinating. I didn't know that, the Germans kind of predated the English and they sort of brought in their own cultures. I wonder if both of you would like to address some of the overlapping themes in the book, the science and faith and the kind of linguistic work they were doing, not only propagating German, but also learning Indian languages. And I know we have recorded, a lot of influence, like the Max Muller coming into India and sort of the Indology stream and all of that. But were the German missionaries specifically focusing on certain areas?
Should I answer that, Christopher?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the German missionaries in the 18th century, it was called the Danish Halle mission, and they were actually, I mean, they came from pietism, the pietist school, which focused a lot on education. So the first thing they did was set up schools, including schools for girls. And the early missionaries learned a lot from the kind of education system that was going on in Tamil Nadu at that time, in Frankaba. So they studied the traditional schools, took over some things. And what they were most impressed by, and which they mention in a lot of their letters, is also the way maths is taught. And they sent the details of that to Germany in order to, that Germans might learn from this. So education was of prime importance, apart from, of course, conversion. Conversion was, of course, the first, and then education, because they wanted to raise a generation of Christians around there. Education, and it was only towards the middle of the 18th century and the second half of the 18th century that some of the missionaries started emphasizing the importance of science, of scientific subjects and science, to be introduced in the schools. So they said it is not just, they didn't actually teach German. They taught, the teachers were Indians and they taught in the mother tongue. The German missionaries all learned Tamil. They had to learn Tamil because as Protestants, you have to be able to read the Bible. So you cannot convert people who cannot, and not have them read the Bible. So they learned Tamil. They translated the Bible into Tamil, the Old and the New Testaments. And so in the early days, it was focus on learning, reading the Bible, learning about Christianity and things like that. And a little bit of vocational training for especially for the poor children who could then take up some, learn a skill and take up some job. It was only later that there was a focus on science, and a lot of the missionaries worked in the area as botanists and as zoologists. These are the two main areas in which they worked, botany and zoology.
Right. Thank you for that. Christopher, I actually want to sort of extend that question to you as well, but also to add that, you create this very real world of the orphanage in Bombay. And it's almost like a Dickensian sort of environment with lots of sort of dark things happening. And the character of the boy, Bartholomew, of course, like he's such a singular character. Can you talk to us about some of the ways in which these things came about? Were they based on research or pure imagination? How did you sort of do this?
Well, it's certainly a mix, like it always is with these in fiction. Like partly there's research in it. I mean, there was an orphanage, there was a mission, and it was also one of the first places in Bombay back then. It was actually headed by two missionaries from Bavaria, and they were Jesuits. So there's some truth in that. It's not like totally made up, and they often took in young children, often who had been like kind of dropped in Bombay, like even sometimes from slave ships or something. So and very very poor boys and raised them. So there's definitely a truth in that. I mean, Bartholomew is probably the most fictional aspect of the whole novel. But of course, he stands in for a certain group of people in this expedition, in the story, and also in the Indian environment, being like basically the weakest link, as it seems in the beginning, at least. But then again, there's also some truth in it that is like more connected with me in the sense that obviously I haven't lived in the mid 19th century or 18th century or whatever in the past, but certain experiences I had as a child. For example, I was part of a boys' choir in Bavaria, which was, let's say, socially very problematic. How lots of boys, like especially like in a boarding school when they were young, it's like there's a lot of hierarchy and stuff happening. I went for the kindergarten. I grew up in a very small Bavarian village, and my kindergarten, the head of this kindergarten were two nuns. Actually, it was a very Catholic place still, and the only kindergarten that existed there was headed by two nuns. My nun was called Sister Alfonsa, and she was very much against Coca-Cola. I remember she always would say like, Coca-Cola is the devil's drink. And for a while after the kindergarten time, I always would make fun of it. Now, much older, I'm like, maybe she was not so wrong, you know. I know what she meant now. And so like, but there was certain experiences, I said, that fueled this experience of the child in a kind of like sometimes a hostile environment. And then of course part of it is that I saw as the protagonist, I saw this character, someone who, you know, who has all odds against him. Basically everything makes it more difficult for him in life. He's a child, he has no parents, he's not from any important family. Like he doesn't know his age. Of course, that also means he doesn't know anything about his caste at that time and everything. So I felt like everything has to be against him. And still, there's a huge driving force that makes him overcome so many obstacles. And to a certain extent, I myself sometimes wondered, like, how does he do that? Like, I mean, I wanted him to succeed often, but I'm like, I wish I had that. And maybe part of his energy and part of his obsession and his conviction that he will succeed in the end, maybe part of that is actually what I wish I would have had as a child, but also still would have now, you know, because there's, you know, part of the writer's life. Doubting it's like a very constant thing. So I would love to sometimes have this complete conviction, but of course I can't, you know, because then I can't write. If I find everything's beautiful I'm writing, then it's really hard to be a good writer.
I think one of the most fascinating things about Bartholomew to me was his fluency with languages. You know, he speaks as many languages, and this is the kind of spirit which is very much around in India. I mean, Rekha, you would agree that we are sort of mostly multilingual, all of us. We speak so many languages, but to hear him speak German, and I just wondered, as a matter of curiosity, what kind of German does he speak? Is it very like Echt German or Bavarian inflected German? That's something he points out from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, you may know, you may not know, like, you know, in German there's a thing called like High German, which goes back to a specific part of Germany, but at some point, basically, most of Germany agreed to that this is the real German, whatever that means, and we call it High German, so that most people in Germany, mind you, not in Austria or in Switzerland, but in Germany, speak that kind of German, and they write it. And so he basically uses that because he is a strong believer in science, and, you know, it's the language of science, it's a language of the educated people. But if, you know, in Germany, if you go back long enough, further enough, then you, if you go into the local languages, you realize that many or some of the dialects that we have nowadays actually used to be languages. And I sometimes wonder when I you know, I come from Bavaria, and when people speak Bavarian, it's more or less you can understand it. But if someone, even if you speak High German, but if you don't know German too well and you go to the Bavarian region and someone speaks really strongly Bavarian, you might be wondering what the language that you've learned, because you might not be able to understand it. It's even more so with Swiss German, for example, which I don't understand if people speak it. And I sometimes wonder if this is something that is going to happen in India in the next few hundred years, like that certain languages will just be lost and people at some point just have this accent and people are like, you sound like someone who, you know, from that region, but you don't speak the language, you just sound a little bit like that. He does definitely speak that High German, but he also, of course, says about himself that he speaks Bavarian because he considers it a language that he's learning, and he's very fond of that. And he also believes that not only, you know, you should learn many languages, but he also believes, which I believe, that if you speak every language that you speak turns you also a little bit into a different person. Like depending on what language you're in, you have a little bit of different persona. And I think many people who do that, especially like in India, like I agree with you. I don't think I've ever met anyone in India who only speaks one language, can observe that with themselves. You know, you're a little bit different in the other language, about your behavior, about how you're joking, and how you talk with others.
Absolutely. I think even the English we speak is so, variegated and across the spectrum, like one kind of English is not the kind of English we speak. We speak
Absolutely.
many Englishes, as it were.
Yeah.
I have two daughters, and the older one is she's picking up more and more of like the distinctions of English. For example, it's very funny when we're in India how she more and more so there's a certain way of how she talks and how she pronounces things, obviously, but it's like it sounds so different from the English that it's not only sounding, but the attitude is very different from the way English-speaking kids that she meets here in Berlin are like. And even the smallest one, who's not even 2 years old yet, she's correcting me because she learned to sing last time we were there. They were outside, and there was like the subsidy water was outside, and someone was calling him, and then she copied, and she said, she's like 1.5 years old, so she's like, "Baya papaya." And she's like shouting for this guy. And now when I say to her, "Baya papaya," then I say it very German, and she's like, "Baya papaya." She's like correcting me already that to pronounce it the right way. And then I realized like, oh, how much I'm Germanizing the Indian accent.
I think that's the beauty of living languages, because they're constantly changing and morphing into different forms and shapes. And actually, on that note, I wanted to ask you, Rekha, I mean, when you were translating the book and the characters have such distinct voices, personalities, the way they speak, for once, I never felt that, anybody was speaking in the same way. Was it a challenge to translate this book, or what kind of challenges did you face while translating this book?
Well, I'm glad you said that, you said that everyone speaks in a very distinct way, somehow that was never there. I got it from the German text, not from the German language in the text, but from the novel itself. And I don't think I thought too much about it. So if it has come through, although, one view could be that I could have had, I could have given the Indians in the novel a more Indian voice, but that would have meant changing, sort of using a different kind of English. But all the characters come from different areas, different regions. I'm not familiar with with the languages spoken there, so I wouldn't know how it would affect the English. And that would have been one problem. And the second problem is that in this novel, it is not about like, let's say a Kannada novel translated into English would have to retain the flavor of Kannada. But this is not a Kannada novel translated into English. This is a German novel. So there I did not find the scope, let's say, for doing something like this. And as far as the challenges are concerned, I have to say that it was very, it is written in a very straightforward manner. There is not much wordplay. There are one or two small wordplays which I was not able to render into English. For example, where he talks about, what is the name of the country? And he says the Schweiz, Switzerland. So the Schweiz, he says, what a weird name, what a strange name. Now, this is because in German, the German word Schweiz is similar to Schweiz. So he says, what a strange name that is. And if I couldn't translate that. So I think I left out that sentence, that one sentence. So, but otherwise, it was basically a matter of getting the ideas behind the sentences in German into English. Sort of not just the sentences, but, what is being transported by these sentences. So that was for me the most important. And I think, I did this during the pandemic. I started it in 2020, and it saved my life because it gave me something really interesting to do. I was stuck in Hyderabad in a relatively new place, and I stuck at home. So this was a life savior for me, and it didn't have those kind of challenges that a Gitanjali Shree novel had, for translation.
And if I may point out, like one of the important things is, for example, that Rekha got very right from the beginning, and which I would always be anxious about if someone translates. For example, like what you said, like the sentences themselves are not very complicated sometimes, but it's more you can say like the irony, the humor, for example, that is there with a lot of the sentence, how Bartholomew talks about things. And if you don't get that right, then a lot gets wrong, because that's you pointed out earlier, Somak, that there's also a lot of dark aspects of the book, but for me it's also a lot about how this character deals with it. So if the way he tells it and how he describes some of these things, there's a brutality between how lightly he takes them on and how he makes fun of them, but at the same time, what is actually going on there? And that is all through the language. So that is something you have to figure out, especially if you translate it. And that's something I would always be like looking at least when I would read an English translation of my books, because that's the only language I would be able to more or less be able to tell whether or not it's there. And I've had experiences in the past where when I've written a different book was translated, at least a sample of it was translated into English, and I felt, whoa, now it sounds actually heavier, which I found was the strangest experience for me, because usually German, just the language itself, lends itself to feeling a little bit heavier. It's just like a lot of that's something that comes along with language, obviously. And so with Germany, a word like, let's say the most common word like love, a word like love, you can use very easily in the English language nowadays, whereas in Germany it's still like Liebe has is something more serious and more heavier. You can't just say like, I mean, you can say it, and young people sometimes might say it, but you can't actually say, I remember that slogan from McDonald's a few years ago, I'm loving it. So like, you can't say I love McDonald's. That's not like, it's like Liebe is like poetry. Liebe is like getting married. So you can't just say that about fast food.
McDonald's.
So so in order to translate that, you have to really figure that out. And I think that's something that Rekha did really well, because obviously she was a perfect translator with the background of knowing German so well, knowing Indian languages, knowing English, even having like being a scientist partly in that field. So like that was all perfect, but all of that wouldn't have had mattered if she had translated the book in a tone where it would have felt like, but that's not my Bartholomew talking, that's someone very different.
I completely agree. I hear you. I think Bartholomew is such a wry character. He has such a fantastic sense of humor. And for me, it's very interesting how he's got this very sort of shifting sense of self. He doesn't know where he is, how to locate himself, whether he's German or Indian, or even in terms of the Indian languages, he feels quite torn. And I wonder if you would like to talk about, Christopher, about his relationship with the missionaries. I mean, there is a lot of love there, and then there's a lot of hate and suspicion. How you sort of built this character almost like a receptacle into which a lot of ideas have been also come in, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that drew me to the topic and to the story, was that I felt like, yeah, I mean, of course we can always start by saying we basically agree that colonialism was a very bad thing, that a lot of people, like some people went to other parts of the world and exploited and enslaved and so on, other people, sure. But if you look closer, then it suddenly gets more interesting, because then things become complex. Just as what Rekha mentioned before about the missionaries, the German missionaries, they were missionaries, and of course they wanted people to turn Christian, but then they also brought schools and allowed girls to come to school. So it's like there's always some, like, I call it like positive collateral damage in a way. Like that's not that they didn't even would think like, okay, missionaries, the first thing I think like is, oh God, this is just horrible. But there's always something good can come out of it, which is not to defend it. But that's also how I felt about Bartholomew in the beginning, that I think in the beginning he thinks like the world is very black and white, it's very simple, because he knows, like, he feels like I'm Indian and the Britishers, they're like these terrible guys, and science is great. and that's how that's his starting point. And he bugs, and the longer he travels, the more he gets confused, and the more he gets to understand how complex the world is and why all the problems that are there are actually there. Because yeah, sure, colonialism is bad, but then there's some, I don't know, let's say like a historical figure like this for example, the opium trader from Bombay, the first Indian to get a knighthood, Gigi Boy, who he's an Indian and he is totally working with the British people. And so, like, is he a good guy because he's Indian, or is he actually quite a problematic figure because he goes after the money and he doesn't care so much if there are like millions of people get into a drug addiction just because he makes money on it. But then there's also a guy like this general governor of the East India Company in Calcutta, who is on the one hand like introduces the doctrine of labs and with a lot of basically evil governing thoughts behind it, but at the same time also introduces like colleges for women, so because he believes that a society can only progress if women have access to knowledge, and so all these encounters and all the experiences that Bartholomew makes, the more he travels, the more it's an awakening, it's a coming of age story, but it's also a realization where he finds out that there's no such thing as a good person or a bad person. There's just like people who do good things and some people who do bad things, and sometimes that's the same person. And that makes things, of course, very complicated. And it's something also that I feel like even nowadays, most of the time we would not like to admit, like we want to look up to someone, or we want to say like this is a bad person. And that makes us feel safe. And I feel like one of the reasons it makes us feel safe is if we would admit that this person is more complicated than that, then we would also admit that that's also inside us, because we usually believe we are like a good person, and these other guys are the bad guys. But if we believe that even a evil person does something good, that means that also there's some like a possibility of evil at least inside ourselves. And I think that's a crushing realization he has at some point. And he realizes that there's no such thing as a good or a bad. And that's what I also like about literature and books and stories, that you get to see and realize more how complex the world is, and that there are unfortunately no easy answers.
Absolutely. I think it's kind of a rite of passage for him as well to sort of go through this experience as he travels all over India. I think I'll come back to Bartholomew and the Schlagentweit brothers, but I want to ask Rekha as well. So just to share a thought, while I was reading this book, I was thinking that this book is actually about language as currency. Translation and interpretation, these become currency in this book. And I wonder how you reacted to the book as a translator before you started translating it. What was your reaction to this layer of the story?
Well, to be honest, this is the very first novel I've ever translated in my life. I am not a professional translator. It is just because Christopher very kindly agreed to let me do the translation. Otherwise, I've translated very heavy, boring academic tomes. But you're right. Language translation is the currency here. And I mean, I think it is really very important to have first of all, to have a knowledge of languages, and yet also, I think, to value the work of a translator and an interpreter, because that is often not given very much value in many fields. If you're an interpreter, for example, I mean, and this has happened to me, I was interpreting for a German delegation once in Delhi, and there was a lunch at the ambassadors, and I was told to stand behind them first. And then it was the ambassador who said, no, she has to sit. But I was supposed to, while they were having their lunch, I was supposed to stand behind them and interpret between them. So, these kind of things. So I think the importance of language, the importance of translation and interpretation, because as you say, even in India, there are so many languages, we don't speak all the languages. How would we get access to literatures in other in the languages we don't know if it weren't for translators. And that is why I think it is, sort of Bartholomew as a translator is performing a very important role, according to me. But I didn't think about those things when I first read the novel, because for me, having worked on Indian imaginations in German literature, India and German literature from the 18th century onwards, I was, that was the aspect which interested me. These three German brothers who I'd heard of before, but I'd never read very much about them, and now told in this very fantastic way through, and of course, with this completely different narrative perspective from anything I've read before. So that is what fascinated me about the novel.
Thank you. It's also interesting how language becomes a source of power for Bartholomew, because there's this point when he mistranslates, and it's really funny. He starts, jumbling up things and people misunderstand each other. And I was reading and thinking, this is like language as weapon almost, translation as weapon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would fully agree with you. Yeah.
So I really enjoyed that. And Christopher, I wanted to also ask you about the brothers, the three brothers who come here and work on, I mean, that's of course historically documented and everything, but their characters are fleshed out with such detail and all of that. I mean, what is the source of that? Is this entirely your imagination, or did they leave behind lots of writings about India? I know they did some documentation, but what kind of literature did they leave behind?
Well, they left actually behind quite a bit, in the sense that they were closely documenting most of their trips. So there's actually thousands of pages about this voyage, and so I guess unfortunately I had to read all of it because they were not, I would say, they're not great writers. So sometimes you had to drag through 50 pages of description of the rainfall in a certain region, and every day how they go back there and they measure it, and then all kinds of numbers and so on. But I mean, of course, I fleshed out their characters the way that's what I took from the descriptions and from what we know about them. They probably would complain if they could come back and read about themselves, because obviously they become fictional characters, but that's not necessarily the point. I mean, I would try to stay as close as possible to their documentation, sometimes as close as to, if it rains on a certain day in a novel, that's actually the day it rained according to their notes. But at the same time, of course, they also stand in for a certain kind of traveler of that time in India. And if the guy who talks the most is also happens to be in real life the guy who also went on extensive today we would call it TED Talks about India, and after their journey, and who would write extensively about it, and who would write articles and publish about it, I assume that this is probably the guy who really wants to be heard, so he's probably the guy who's more chatty than the other two. And for example, the other brother who was more responsible for the photography and the taking images, and who has to deal with that, maybe he's not, he's a character, back in that day, who had to go under his, I don't know how to call the professional term for that, the curtain, you went behind when you were taking images. So he's probably more held back. Also, he's much younger than the others are, and at the beginning he wasn't even supposed to be coming along. So that's kind of how I was trying to portray them. But at the same time, of course, they are also a little bit types. It meanders, it changes from time to time. But there's this traveler who at some point they have this very interesting argument about someone who misbehaves in their expedition, and so the one brother is we have to punish him just like we would punish everyone here in this expedition, and the other brother is, and we have to, I don't know, whip him or do something like that. And so the other brother is, no, we don't have to do that, because he's not like everyone else, and he is Indian. So so that's this racial component, which is interesting, because so the guy who doesn't want to punish him, who wants to be kind, is the guy who doesn't want it because he believes he didn't know better. He's Indian, you know. So but the guy who wants to punish him believes like we're all the same. So he should also be whipped. I should be whipped, but he should also be whipped. So so there's different types how you approach this whole aspect of like race at that time and traveling to a region like that. So like on whose side would you be on, you know? And there were these types. There were these types, and like Rekha described earlier in history, the people who came, for example, to India. So it seems like they were more interested in also getting more knowledge and also like talking on a similar level and learning. Like it was more transaction, more kind of a trade also of ideas or of information. You know, like even the early British, they, you know, some of them wore the Indian clothes, and you see the images, and they have Indian wives sometimes, and you know, learning the languages. But like later on, actually around the time when this book, when the story takes place, and after that, it became much harsher and much more clear cut that, you know, you don't learn the language, then you're not allowed to marry anyone from India and so on. So there, the whole component of race and racism becomes much stronger, and that's also something I felt like I kept play around with a lot with these three brothers and show like the different ways of dealing with it, like confronting it, ignoring it, or seeing it in a different way. So they also, yeah, they represent people from that time.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how the three brothers are constantly sort of bickering among each other, and there are these tensions and conflicts that come out. I was also very interested in the placement of this novel in history. You know, it's very close to 1857, and the Sepoy Mutiny actually, or you know, whatever the correct term is, you know, the revolt actually starts brewing around the time when they're traveling through India. I wonder what made you think of this intersection of history, you know, like as one part of the country was erupting into this kind of revolt, and there were these brothers who were carrying on this very clinical scientific expedition. If you could talk about that intersection a bit.
Sure. I mean, that was kind of like, I felt like a gift, because it was like perfect. Not only there was everything was there. This didn't have to be there, but it so happened that the expedition came or happened at least partly at the same time when the uprising rebellion when it happened. And so I felt like, oh, that's great, because you have the whole historical backdrop. So people are, first of all, at least in India or in certain parts of the world, they might be a little bit more connected to that time because they know a little bit about it or have learned a bit about it. But it's also nice because you can tell so much about the whole of society with that. And for me, it weren't those two things, like the expedition and the uprising, were not disconnected so much, but it was actually like a great opportunity to show a little bit like about the conflicts that were growing anyway in the country. And I mean, of course, the way I describe it, and I don't want to spoil things, but the way I describe it, of course, is that the expedition was very much actually involved, like almost like to the extent of like sparking the rebellion. And that was of course also some fun for me to like you know like using a fictional character and suddenly putting him in the position and at the most important connecting points for a big historical event. But yeah, for me it was like it refers to the greater theme of like colonialism and you know, and who's get to say what, and who is superior to who, and who is uniting against who, and how complicated that is. And that's also, again, another thing that Bartholomew has to learn along the way, that, you know, like, it's easy to say the oppressor are the British, but like then, like if the scientists who he admires so much are working for the British and giving them information, aren't they also the enemies? Or if you're siding with the scientists and they're working with the British, then maybe you are also on that side and you're not actually on the Indian side. So you have to ask yourself that, and maybe there's no clear answer to that, and that's really troublesome for him, of course. But I think that's something that, to a certain extent, of course, not in such a brutal way, but to a certain extent, is still very important to think about until today, because like a lot of these events that happened in that century, I feel like define ourselves still up to this point. That's how we look at the world still at this point. Like that's how we through that lens and how through that filter we talk about things. And if I don't know if in Germany the topic of say like museum objects comes up and people say like, yeah, this object should be returned, let's say to India, then usually the first argument against it will be, yeah, that's true, but if you return it, the state museums will not take care of it enough, and so it will not be kept well, and then it will fall apart or something. So should we actually return it? And of course, the really think about this is it might not be wrong that some museums might not take care of it, but the bigger problem is that who are you to decide that? Who are you to decide for others and say like, yeah, we can't, should we return it because they can't take care of it? Like that's still the heritage we're dealing with from the colonial times, and people are not even aware of that. You know, there's like imagine the other way around. There would be an uproar. Imagine someone from India would say that we can't give it to Germany because they're not going to take care of it. Everybody will be like, haha, that's so funny. That would never happen. Yeah, because of that historical background. And I think that's something that we still have to confront. And that's why I also found the whole topic so interesting. I'm not I don't write usually historical novels in that sense that I'm like just interested in telling a story about history. I'm more interested in it because it tells me so much about why the things are the way they are today.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I will actually come back to the about accumulation of objects in museums in my next few questions. But before I ask my next couple of questions, I would like to invite the audience to send any questions on the chat if they would like. And while we wait for those questions, I actually want to ask Rekha here about, you know, what Christopher was just speaking about, the ownership of knowledge and the circulation of knowledge is one of the sort of big themes of this book. And of course, it was one of the colonial projects, and kind of hegemony sort of started building around those times. But although we know, obviously, for obvious reasons, a lot about the British influence, so what kind of influence did the German missionaries or German colonizers, they were not colonizers, they were missionaries coming in. What kind of influence did they leave behind? And especially since you spoke about education, what kind of educational projects did they start? Did a lot of people speak German, Indian people in those times? What was happening around those times?
Okay, let me take it back a little and start from, let's say, 1711. That was when one of the missionaries from the second cohort of missionaries sent a massive tract to Germany, which he called Medicus Malabaricus, the Malabarian doctor. And this was a tract which he had translated with the help of Tamil doctors from Siddha medicine, sort of tracts of Siddha medicine written in Tamil, translated for him from Tamil into German, translated for him from Sanskrit into Tamil, which he then translated into German and sent to Germany. So this was within this Danish Halle mission. This was one of the first areas where a circulation of knowledge happened, where Indian Ayurvedic Siddha medicine, medical knowledge was, and very detailed, was sent to Germany. Unfortunately, that manuscript was never published in Germany, probably because, they didn't find it. Okay, it was because of different understanding of what medicine is in Pietism, and because the missionary clearly links the medicine to the belief also, to Hindu beliefs, which they did not appreciate in Germany. So that is how it began. As far as educational projects go, I don't think there is much left behind. It was only in the latter half of the 18th century that a lot of the students pupils in the schools learned German also, but it was not a subject that was taught necessarily. So it is not a question of their learning German, but it was a question of how in fact, here it was partly one-sided. Knowledge from India was gathered and sent to Europe, where scientists in Europe use this knowledge to establish their own, to establish, not their own. They always said that this came from India, from this particular missionary. But a lot of knowledge from India was inculcated into European science of the time. Let's put it that way. Yeah, whether it is in the Kew Gardens, where one of the later botanist missionaries sent his specimens, or earlier to many botanical gardens and botanists in Germany. So it was knowledge from India going to Germany, or things from India going to Germany. But as far as the later missionaries, as far as the missionaries were concerned, they were bringing, especially the later ones, they were bringing modern European education to India, yeah, by including different subjects within the school curriculum. Yeah? So I think it is more of that kind. But of course, this whole discussion about museums and what, who does it belong to today? Where I used to work, the archives in this place called Halle an der Saale in East Germany, they have a lot of the things that the missionaries sent back, the actual objects. Yes, among them is a Vishnu shrine. What is a shrine? It's not a, it's a kind of a foldable Vishnu shrine, which these traveling people used to take around and tell stories about the god. And that is there in their museum, in their little museum. So the question that arose was, who does it, it should go back. But no one knows who it belongs to, because one of the missionaries bought it from one of these itinerant travelers. So, but the questions are coming up even there. Sorry, I mean, I don't know if I've answered your question, but
that's very interesting. I want to look this up later on. But actually, thank you for bringing up the museum point, because that was kind of my sort of concluding gambit to Christopher, but to talk about the museum aspect of it and Bartholomew's understanding of what a museum means. It's so fascinating, as an object, as an idea, as an experience. What does it mean to him, basically?
Yeah, I mean, of course, in the beginning, he has it starts out with being something very concrete, like, he even has this little box where he is collecting certain objects. And it soon becomes something much bigger, where, but a lot of this idea is, of course, it's still by Father Fuchs, who is kind of his surrogate father. He basically gives him this idea that, well, that the museum is something like a temple, but in the sense that you everything from your culture, everything from your country and your people can be inside this museum. And if anyone from your culture and your people goes into this museum, they are reminded of who they are, and it gives them confidence and makes them strong. So like that's how he sees at least the British Museum, where the British would, enter the museum and see like, okay, we are obviously powerful people because we are ruling over many parts of the world, and we have brought all these objects back. Nobody could keep us from doing that, and we can just do that. So like it gives you a certain confidence. So he feels like this is something that India needs at that time, because then they're all united and they see who they are, and if you see who you are, you can be more confident, stronger, and you can fight back and become independent from any colonial kind of rule. I know it's not a colony, strictly speaking, at that point yet, but it's similar. So but then he sees it also in a larger aspect, not only in terms of like bringing like actual objects, but more in the sense of everything that concerns the culture. And then sometimes it could be like a feeling, or he describes it as things that are too dangerous or invisible or too big to bring into a museum. He can put all of them in the museum, because the whole book itself is his museum. That's why it's called the Museum of the World. Like he at some point he realizes he can't like obviously carry around or actually establish that room, like that physical room. He has to write about it, and it's sometimes a little bit like a diary, but it's also it's a collection of all the things that he encounters. And so the chapters are not really chapters; they are actually objects. He's focusing more on certain objects, and sometimes it's something like a feeling like loneliness, but sometimes it can also be one of those brothers who he turns into objects, because that's something, of course, these travelers at that time you often would do to other people in other parts of the world, that they objectify them, they look at them and see like, oh yeah, okay, so that's strange and how they behave. So he's doing that to these to the scientists, but he's also doing it to Vishnu for that matter, or like whatever he comes across and he thinks about, and along those objects we learn his story. There are still chapters, but it is a kind of his way of collecting his own world, of course the troublesome problem with that is that he'll also encounter at some point is that nowadays museums have a very, very positive connotation. Most people think of it, the worst they think of a museum is probably that they're boring, but they're very positively connotated because of knowledge and science. But at that time, museum people forget, and that's also what Bartholomew is not yet aware of in the beginning of the story, is that the museum is a colonial institution, and that it comes from something like the British Museum, that it comes from the idea that you represent all the stuff you've taken from other places, and you don't have to give it back. This is something he'll have to grasp along the way and along his travels, along with other realizations about his identity that he's not aware of, that you don't know how much you're colonized, how much your soul has been colonized, until you actually know. Like, for example, his name. He's very fond of being Indian, but in the beginning he doesn't question that his name is Bartholomew, and he also doesn't question that he's writing this book, his story, in German. Now it's translated into English, but in original he writes in German because he believes that's his language of science. So if he's so strongly so fond of India, why is he not writing it in an Indian language? And that's some of the realizations he has to confront and deal with. And I think that's something that, again, that I just felt or encountered a lot when I'm, for example, in India, or I'm here, like in both ways, because to that extent, I always feel like that, people in former colonies, their souls have been colonized, and that's something we still deal with today. So that people still have a certain attitude to certain things where you feel like, okay, that's just the heritage of that time, but it's actually not true anymore. But also the colonizers colonized their own souls. Like there was a smaller incident a few days, a week or so ago. I don't know if you heard about it. It's like in Germany that there was this thing that's when the population, India's population outgrew, overtook China as the major population country in the world, and there was this little cartoon in a German magazine called Der Spiegel, which is considered like progressive magazine, like more very left, and they did some important and impressive reporting in the past. And they had this cartoon, and the cartoon was like there's this speed train from China, like two guys driving it really fast and slender, and there's this Indian train with people sitting on top and on the side and everywhere, and they're taking over. They're faster than the speed train, and that's their depiction of India. And we all know these trains do exist, and they existed for a long time. That's true. But that's the image that in Germany, like this cartoonist was associating with an Indian train, and rightly so. For example, even the German ambassador to India, he said, like, well, I would like to invite this cartoonist to come to Delhi and see how the metro here runs much better than the S-Bahn in Berlin, and how some of the trains are here much more on time. Because like 50% of our trains in Germany are not on time anymore, actually. So we have a big problem with that. So, but it's that colonial story that we still prefer, that we still culture, where people like, it's like it's funny, like look at it's like a funny Indian train. Which comes from a historic place.
Right. It's great how Bartholomew sort of owns his own museum of memories and feelings and things and objects and food. Everything he wants to own is in that museum. And I think it's kind of a reversal of, it's kind of the tables are turned almost in the project of ownership. I have two questions actually from Anuradha, and both are for Christopher, about the choice of Bartholomew's name and why did you make him an orphan? That's the first one.
Okay, yeah. And well, sometimes also, you know, as a writer, you make like technical decisions. Like one of the advantages of having an orphan is you don't have to deal with the parents. You know, if you have a child, protagonist and hero, like in many situations, you would say like, but wait, if the parents were there, they would not allow this, or they would take care of him, or they would protect him. But they're just not, you know, it's not very helpful sometimes to have parents in terms of telling a story, because they might just interfere and they might make it less interesting. So that's an obvious reason. But the other reason is also that, of course, the interesting thing about Bartholomew is that he doesn't know too much about his past, and he figures out much about his past along the way. And when he grows up, and some of the things he finds out, he might not have wanted to know. You know, so when he finds them out, he's actually quite shocked about his identity in his past. And the second question, well, I mean, he states a lot of things, and sometimes I feel like he's this mixture of sometimes saying like a wise person because he's a child. You know, so sometimes children say things just the way they are, they see them much more clearly and not all gray and muddled up like we parents or grown-ups do. So sometimes I feel like a child can be much wiser in its comments and its reactions to things. At the same time, of course, much more naive sometimes because they are lacking fundamentally experience. And so what I like about Bartholomew is that sometimes he really states these really big things where, you know, you would usually hear from some like philosopher with a long gray beard. And then you can think about like, is this just a naive boy talking, or is there actually something to it? And like one of the sentences would be probably unique things are only born under great pressure. So now does he say, you know, maybe this refers to the writer writing the book? I don't know. Or does it refer to Bartholomew, you know, like as an excuse of like what he produced here? I would have to, I don't know what chapter he says that exactly now. So maybe he's trying to explain something to us, or wants to at least tell himself that it's okay that he's under a lot of pressure, because only then he will succeed.
Yeah, I think that's the fascination with him for me, but because he's so precautious as a child, and yet childlike and vulnerable. Sometimes he will just, you know, start crying or whatever. You know, there is a kind of mix of the adult and the child in him, and it coexists very beautifully, I think. I don't think we have more questions, and we are just on time to finish the session. So I just want to thank both of you for this wonderful session. And Christopher, I hope your books will be translated more into English and we get a chance to read them. And Rekha, I hope you'll translate more, because this is such a wonderful translation. It really made my day.
Thank you so much. It was like a great moderation. I was happy to have that conversation now, at that time of the year when usually my family is not in India, and at least we live in a time when we can do it this way. And yeah, thank you for hosting and for all the questions. It was really lovely, and great to see you, and hope to see you next time we are all there.
Thank you so much, Somak. Yeah, that was a very, very interesting conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Word Lab.
Thank you, Word Lab, also. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, all of you. This was such a great conversation, and I wish we had a little bit more time, but we like to keep things a little tight. So hopefully you guys will just come back and we'll do this in person. Thank you so much, and everybody else, thank you for joining us, and hope everyone has a lovely evening, and happy rest of the day, Christopher. I think you have more lines.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Good night. Have a nice evening.